Berlin, 1943. The searchlights cut through the winter fog like claws, and the sound of boots on cobblestone echoed through streets that had learned to hold their breath. Every door could hide a secret. Every basement could shelter the hunted. And in the heart of Nazi Germany, where the Gestapo's eyes were everywhere, one man made a decision that would defy every rule of survival. Adolf Althoff, a circus director with calloused hands and a lion tamer's nerve, opened the door of his elephant wagon and whispered to a Jewish family of 4 to climb inside. The smell of hay and animal sweat would become their sanctuary. The rumble of pachyderm feet would mask their heartbeat. And for the next 2 years, while the Third Reich tore Europe apart, this family would live inches away from tusks, trunks, and almost certain death. The circus had always been a world apart, a kingdom of sawdust and sequins that rolled from town to town, indifferent to borders or politics. Althoff's circus was no different. It carried acrobats from Romania, clowns from France, and elephants that had been born in captivity and knew no other home. But by 1943, the circus had become something else entirely, a moving target under constant scrutiny. Nazi officials attended every show, their uniforms crisp, their eyes sharp. They were looking for subversion, for weakness, for anyone foolish enough to defy the Führer's orders. And the orders were clear. Jews were to be reported, registered, and removed. No exceptions, no mercy, no hiding. To shelter a Jew was to sign your own death warrant, and everyone knew it. Adolf Althoff knew it too. He was not a resistance fighter. He had no training in espionage, no network of forgers or safe houses. He was a showman, a man who had spent his life teaching elephants to bow and lions to sit on command. But in the spring of 1943, a friend came to him in desperation. The friend's name was Peter Buch, and he was Jewish. His wife, his 2 young children, and his mother-in-law were running out of places to hide. The net was tightening, the deportations were accelerating, and Buch had heard a rumor, a whisper, that Althoff might be the kind of man who would not turn his back. He was right. Althoff looked at the faces of the children, at the hollow eyes of the mother, and made a choice that most men would never dare to make. He did not hesitate. He did not calculate the odds. He simply said yes. The plan was insane. The Buch family would travel with the circus, hidden inside the elephant wagon, a cramped wooden box on wheels that reeked of manure and straw. During the day, while the circus set up its tents and rehearsed its acts, the family would remain silent, motionless, pressed against the walls as the elephants shifted and swayed. During inspections, when Nazi officers walked through the grounds with clipboards and suspicion, the family would hold their breath and pray that the sound of their own fear would not betray them. And at night, when the crowds had left and the performers had collapsed into their bunks, Althoff would bring them food, water, and news from the outside world. He would tell them which towns were safe, which borders were closed, and how much longer they would have to endure this living tomb. But this was not a story of passive survival. Althoff did not simply hide the Buch family and hope for the best. He transformed them into ghosts within his own operation, weaving them into the fabric of circus life in ways that defied detection. When the circus crossed into occupied territories, Althoff forged documents that listed the family as essential workers, caretakers of the animals, invisible cogs in the machinery of entertainment. When local authorities demanded a full head count, Althoff bribed, charmed, and lied with the skill of a man who had spent a lifetime reading crowds. And when suspicion grew too close, when a Gestapo officer lingered too long near the elephant wagon, Althoff would stage a distraction. A lion would roar, a trapeze artist would fall, and in the chaos, the danger would pass. For 2 years, the Buch family lived in the shadow of tusks, and under the protection of a man who had no reason to risk everything, except for one. He believed that some lines should never be crossed, even when the whole world was crossing them. The circus rolled on from Berlin to Prague, from Munich to Vienna, carrying its secret like a beating heart beneath the big top. And in 1945, when the Reich finally collapsed and the camps were liberated, the Buch family emerged from the elephant wagon, blinking in the light of a shattered Europe, alive because one man had decided that humanity was worth more than survival. Before the war turned Adolf Althoff into a savior, He was simply a man who understood animals better than he understood people. He had inherited the circus from his father, a stern Bavarian who believed that discipline and repetition were the keys to taming both beasts and audiences. Althoff grew up in that world, sleeping in wagons, waking to the smell of sawdust and coffee, learning that survival in the circus meant constant movement, constant adaptation. By the time he was 30, he could read an elephant's mood from the twitch of its ear, calm a panicked horse with a whisper, and gauge a crowd's hunger for spectacle within the first 5 minutes of a show. He was not a political man. He did not read manifestos or attend rallies, but he had traveled enough of Europe to know that borders were imaginary lines, that people were the same no matter what flag flew above them, and that cruelty, when it came, always announced itself with uniforms and paperwork. The circus had always been a refuge for the misfit and the marginal, a place where nationality mattered less than skill and loyalty mattered more than lineage. Althoff's troupe was a patchwork of languages and backgrounds, a Romanian knife thrower who had fled poverty, a French acrobat who had abandoned a factory job, a Hungarian strongman who spoke 5 languages and trusted none of them. They were bound not by blood or belief, but by the shared understanding that the circus was a world unto itself, a kingdom that answered to no one but the crowds. And the crowds, even in the darkest years of the war, still came. They came to forget. They came to escape. They came because the circus promised a kind of magic that the Third Reich, for all its pomp and propaganda, could never manufacture. Under the big top, for 2 hours the war did not exist. The elephants danced, the clowns stumbled, and the audience laughed, a sound that had become rare and precious. But by 1943, the illusion of separation had begun to crack. The Nazi regime had taken notice of the circus, not as entertainment, but as a potential tool. Officials began attending performances, not to enjoy the show, but to ensure that it reflected the values of the Reich. They scrutinized every act, every performer, looking for signs of degeneracy, weakness, or dissent. Jewish performers had already been banned. Roma travelers, who had once formed the backbone of traveling circuses across Europe, were being rounded up and sent to camps. The government issued new regulations. Circuses could only travel on approved routes, could only perform in approved towns, and could only employ workers who had been vetted and cleared by the authorities. Althoff watched as his world shrank, as the freedom that had defined circus life was slowly strangled by bureaucracy and fear. He complied, because refusal meant shutdown. He smiled at the officers, because antagonism meant investigation, and he kept moving because standing still meant becoming a target. It was in this climate of tightening control that Peter Buch appeared at the edge of the circus grounds one cold April morning in 1943. Buch was a merchant, a man who had once sold fabric and fine goods in Berlin, a man whose children had attended good schools and whose wife had hosted dinners for friends who had long since stopped answering the door. The Nuremberg laws had stripped him of his business, his home, and his status, but he had managed, through a combination of luck and desperation, to avoid deportation. He had moved his family from apartment to apartment, always one step ahead of the knock on the door, always relying on the kindness of strangers who were themselves risking everything. But the strangers were running out, the safe houses were full, the forgers were overwhelmed, and Buch, standing in the mud outside Althoff's tent, had come to ask for the impossible. Sanctuary in plain sight, refuge in the one place where the Nazis would never think to look. Althoff listened to Buch's story without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. He did not ask why Buch had come to him. He did not ask what would happen if they were caught. He asked only one question: how many? When Buch answered 4, his wife, his 2 children, and his mother-in-law Althoff nodded slowly as if calculating the weight of souls against the weight of risk. Then he walked Buch to the elephant wagon, a sturdy wooden structure that had carried 3 elephants across half of Europe, and opened the door. Inside, the space was tight, dark, and filled with the overwhelming presence of animals who could crush a man without meaning to. Althoff pointed to a narrow gap behind the hay bales, a space barely large enough for one adult to lie down, and told Buch that this would be their home. Buch did not hesitate. He did not ask for better conditions. He simply asked when his family could arrive. Althoff told him to bring them that night after the show, when the crowds had gone and the performers had retreated to their own wagons. And so the pact was made without contracts or promises, sealed only by the understanding that some decisions are made, not because they are safe, but because they are necessary. The Buch family arrived after midnight, moving through the darkness like shadows that had learned to distrust even moonlight. Peter carried his youngest child, a boy of 6, who had been told to pretend he was asleep no matter what happened. His wife Ruth held the hand of their daughter, a girl of 9 whose eyes had already seen too much, whose silence had become a survival skill. Behind them came Ruth's mother, a woman in her 60s who walked with the deliberate slowness of someone who knew that every step forward might be her last. They carried nothing but a single suitcase, packed with clothes that would never be worn, and photographs that would serve as proof they had once existed in a world that now wanted them erased. Althoff met them at the edge of the circus grounds, a lantern in his hand casting long shadows across his face, and led them without a word to the elephant wagon. The door opened with a creak that sounded, in the silence of the night, like a scream. Inside, the reality of their new life became immediately clear. The wagon was divided into 2 sections. The front half belonged to the elephants, 3 massive females named Sari, Lily, and Burma, who shifted and breathed in the darkness like living mountains. The back half, separated by a thin wooden partition, was where the family would live. The space measured roughly 3 meters by 2, barely enough room for 4 people to lie down if they pressed against each other. The floor was covered in straw that smelled of urine and rot. The walls were slick with condensation. There was no window, no ventilation, no light except for the cracks between the wooden slats. Althoff had done his best to prepare it. He had brought blankets, a bucket for waste, and a small oil lamp that could only be lit when the wagon was moving and the smoke could dissipate. But no amount of preparation could change the fundamental truth. This was a cage, and the family was choosing to lock themselves inside. The first night was the hardest. The elephants, disturbed by the presence of strangers, trumpeted and stamped, their massive bodies slamming against the partition with enough force to make the entire wagon shake. The youngest child began to cry, a sound that could not be allowed, and Ruth pressed her hand over his mouth, whispering prayers in his ear until the sobs turned to shudders. The grandmother sat motionless in the corner, her eyes closed, her lips moving in silent conversation with a God she was no longer sure was listening. Peter crouched by the door, watching the slivers of light from the camp outside, calculating how long it would take for someone to notice, how quickly they could run if the door was ripped open. But the door stayed closed. The night passed. And when morning came, Althoff arrived with bread, cheese, and the first rule of their new existence: absolute silence during the day, movement only at night, and trust that he would do everything in his power to keep them alive. The circus resumed its schedule as if nothing had changed. Every morning the troupe broke camp and moved to the next town, the wagons rolling in a long caravan across roads that were increasingly patrolled by soldiers looking for deserters, partisans, and fugitives. The elephant wagon rolled with them, indistinguishable from the others, its secret hidden beneath the noise of creaking wheels and animal sounds. During inspections, which happened with increasing frequency, Althoff would position himself near the wagon, distracting officers with stories about the elephants' training, their diet, their temperament. He would invite them to watch the animals eat, to feel the texture of their skin, to marvel at their strength. And while the officers were captivated by the spectacle of 3-ton beasts performing tricks, the Buch family would press themselves into the farthest corner of the wagon, their hearts hammering, their breath held, praying that the wood would not creak, that the child would not cough, that the grandmother's labored breathing would not give them away. But Althoff's protection extended beyond distraction. He began to weave the family into the fabric of the circus itself, creating a cover story that would hold up under scrutiny. He forged documents identifying Peter Buch as a veterinary assistant, essential for the care of the animals, and listed Ruth as a seamstress responsible for costume repair. The children and the grandmother were listed as dependents, unremarkable, invisible. He bribed local officials with free tickets and private performances, building a network of small debts and favors that would make them less likely to ask questions. And he trained his own troupe, without ever telling them the full truth, to treat the elephant wagon as sacred space, off limits to everyone except himself and his most trusted assistant. The circus became a fortress of secrecy, held together not by walls, but by the unspoken understanding that some mysteries were better left unexamined. Life inside the elephant wagon became a rhythm of deprivation and adaptation, a brutal routine that stripped away everything except the will to survive one more day. The family woke before dawn to the sound of the elephants stirring, their massive bodies shifting in the darkness, their trunks snuffling against the partition as if searching for the source of the unfamiliar human scent. Breakfast, when it came, was whatever Althoff could smuggle without arousing suspicion. Stale bread, bruised apples, sometimes a piece of cheese or sausage that had to be divided into portions so small they barely registered as food. The meals were eaten in silence, chewed slowly to make them last, swallowed with water that tasted of rust from the bucket Althoff refilled each night. Hunger became a constant companion, a hollow ache that never quite disappeared, but the family learned not to speak of it, because speaking made it worse. The days stretched into an eternity of enforced stillness. The children, who had once played in parks and attended school, now spent their hours lying in the straw, whispering stories to each other, inventing games that required no movement and no sound. The daughter taught her brother to count in silence, using her fingers to represent numbers, teaching him arithmetic through gestures alone. The grandmother recited prayers under her breath, her voice so low it was barely a vibration, her hands folded in her lap as if she were sitting in a synagogue instead of a rolling prison. Ruth spent her days mending the few clothes they had, stitching tears by feel in the darkness, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone who needed a task to keep from thinking about what would happen if they were discovered. And Peter kept watch, his ear pressed to the wooden slats, listening for the sound of boots, voices, anything that might signal danger approaching. The greatest torment was not the hunger or the darkness, but the proximity to the elephants, creatures whose presence was both their salvation and their constant threat. Sari, the eldest of the three, had a temperament as unpredictable as weather, calm one moment and agitated the next, her massive body slamming against the partition with enough force to send vibrations through the entire wagon. Lily was gentler, but her size alone made her dangerous, her trunk occasionally snaking through gaps in the wood, searching for food or simply exploring, nearly discovering the family on more than one occasion. Burma, the youngest, was the most curious, and it was Burma who came closest to exposing them. One afternoon, while the circus was stopped for an inspection, Burma became fixated on the partition, pressing her trunk against it, trumpeting softly as if calling to something on the other side. The family froze, their bodies pressed against the far wall, as the elephant's trunk pushed through a gap, inches from the grandmother's face. Outside they could hear the voices of Gestapo officers, their boots crunching on gravel, their questions sharp and suspicious. Althoff's voice rose above the others, loud and jovial, as he led the officers away from the wagon, spinning a story about Burma's training, about her talent for painting with her trunk, about how sensitive she was to disruption. The officers laughed, distracted, and moved on. Inside, the grandmother had not moved, had not breathed, her eyes locked on the trunk that had nearly sealed their fate. The nights brought a different kind of suffering, the cold. As autumn turned to winter, the temperature inside the wagon dropped until frost formed on the wooden walls and their breath came out in clouds. The blankets Althoff had provided were thin and worn, insufficient against the chill that seeped through every crack and seam. The family slept huddled together, sharing body heat, waking every few hours to the sound of their own shivering. The children developed coughs that could not be allowed to persist, and Ruth would press her hand over their mouths, muffling the sound, whispering reassurances even as she felt their small bodies burning with fever. Althoff brought what medicine he could, aspirin stolen from the circus's first aid kit, honey to soothe their throats, extra blankets pilfered from storage. But there were limits to what he could do without drawing attention, and the family understood that their survival depended on their ability to endure without complaint. Yet even in this existence, there were moments of unexpected grace. On nights when the circus was camped far from towns, when the risk of discovery was low, Althoff would open the wagon door and allow the family to step outside for a few minutes, to breathe air that did not smell of animals and waste, to see stars that reminded them a world still existed beyond their wooden cage. The children would stand in silence, their faces turned upward, their eyes wide with wonder at the simple act of seeing the sky. Ruth would hold Peter's hand, squeezing it with a strength that communicated everything words could not, and the grandmother would close her eyes and listen to the wind, a sound she had almost forgotten, a reminder that freedom, however distant, was not yet extinct. These moments lasted only minutes, but they sustained the family for days, proof that they were still human, still alive, still capable of feeling something other than fear. By the winter of 1944, the war had begun to turn, and with it came a new kind of danger, chaos. The Eastern Front was collapsing, and the Reich's grip on occupied Europe was weakening with every passing week. Refugees flooded westward, clogging roads and overwhelming train stations, and in the confusion the Gestapo's paranoia intensified. Checkpoints became more frequent, inspections more thorough, and the penalties for harboring fugitives more severe. Public executions became commonplace, a warning to anyone who might consider defiance. Bodies hung from lampposts in town squares, placards around their necks declaring their crimes. Treason, sabotage, sheltering enemies of the state. Althoff knew that every mile the circus traveled brought them closer to discovery, that the odds were stacking against them, that luck, no matter how carefully cultivated, eventually ran out. But he also knew that stopping was not an option. To stop was to invite scrutiny. To stop was to become a target. So the circus kept moving, and the family kept hiding, and the wagon kept rolling toward an uncertain fate. The closest call came in a small town near the Czech border, a place whose name Althoff would later struggle to remember, but whose horror he would never forget. The circus had set up camp in a field outside the town, and within hours of their arrival, a squad of SS officers appeared, not for entertainment but for a full search of the grounds. They were looking for deserters, they said, soldiers who had abandoned their posts and were rumored to be hiding among traveling shows. The search was methodical and merciless. Every wagon was opened, every trunk inspected, every performer questioned. Althoff watched from a distance, his face calm but his mind racing, as the officers moved systematically through the camp, drawing closer to the elephant wagon with every passing minute. He could not intervene without arousing suspicion. He could not create a distraction without making himself a target. All he could do was stand and watch and hope that the precautions he had taken would be enough. When the officers reached the elephant wagon, they did not simply glance inside and move on. They demanded that Althoff unlock the door, that he show them every inch of the interior, that he explain the purpose of every item and every partition. Althoff complied, his hands steady as he opened the door, his voice casual as he gestured to the elephants, who shifted nervously under the scrutiny of armed men. He explained the layout, the feeding schedule, the need for separation between the animals and their supplies. The officers seemed satisfied, but then one of them, a young lieutenant with pale eyes and a rigid posture, noticed the partition at the back of the wagon. He asked what was behind it. Althoff did not hesitate. He told the officer it was storage, hay bales and equipment, nothing of interest. The officer insisted on seeing it anyway, and in that moment, as Althoff reached for the latch, he knew that everything was about to end. But the elephants, creatures of instinct and routine, had learned to recognize the rhythms of the circus, and they had also learned to recognize danger. As the officer stepped closer, Sari, the eldest and most unpredictable, let out a deafening trumpet and reared back, her massive body slamming against the side of the wagon with enough force to make the entire structure shudder. The officer stumbled backward, his hand instinctively reaching for his pistol, his face flushed with alarm. Althoff seized the moment, his voice rising with practiced authority as he shouted commands to the elephant, telling her to calm down, explaining to the officers that she was protective of her space, that strangers made her aggressive, that entering the wagon now would be dangerous for everyone. The other elephants joined in, their trumpeting filling the air, creating a wall of sound and chaos that made conversation impossible. The officer hesitated, his pride warring with his instinct for self-preservation. Finally, he stepped back, ordering Althoff to keep the animals under control, warning him that any further incidents would result in the circus being shut down. Then he turned and walked away, his squad following, moving on to inspect the next wagon. Inside the partition, the Buch family remained frozen, their bodies pressed together, their lungs burning from holding their breath. They had heard every word, felt every vibration, understood how close they had come to the end. The grandmother's lips moved in silent prayer, thanking a God who had answered through the trumpet of an elephant. The children clung to their mother, their eyes wide and unblinking. And Peter, his hand gripping Ruth so tightly it left marks, allowed himself a single thought. They had survived another day. But he also knew, as they all knew, that the next inspection might not end the same way, that their luck was a finite resource and that every sunrise was borrowed time. As 1945 arrived, the world outside the elephant wagon was disintegrating at a pace that even the most optimistic could no longer deny. Allied bombs rained down on German cities with increasing frequency, reducing entire neighborhoods to rubble and ash. The circus found itself performing in towns that barely existed anymore, setting up tents in fields scarred by craters, entertaining audiences who came not for joy, but for distraction from the apocalypse unfolding around them. Supply lines collapsed, and food became scarce even for those with money and connections. Althoff struggled to feed his troop, much less the hidden family, and the rations he managed to smuggle into the wagon grew smaller and less frequent. The Buch family, already skeletal from months of deprivation, began to fade in ways that went beyond physical hunger. Their eyes grew hollow, their movements slow and deliberate, as if every gesture required a calculation of energy they could no longer afford to waste. The grandmother stopped speaking altogether, conserving her strength, her presence reduced to a whisper of breath in the corner. The children no longer played their silent games. They simply lay still, staring at the wooden ceiling, waiting for the end, whatever form it might take. But Althoff refused to accept defeat, even as the evidence mounted that the Reich's collapse was imminent and that the most dangerous time was not the height of Nazi power, but its final desperate throes. Regimes in their death throes do not become merciful. They become savage, lashing out at anyone they can reach, punishing perceived traitors with a ferocity born of humiliation and rage. Althoff knew this, had seen it in the faces of the officers who now patrolled with wild eyes and trembling hands, men who understood that their world was ending and were determined to drag as many people down with them as possible. He also knew that the circus, with its constant movement and its collection of outsiders, was a perfect target for a regime looking for scapegoats. So he adapted once again, changing routes without notice, avoiding towns where Wehrmacht units were known to be stationed, bribing officials not with money, which had become worthless, but with food, medicine, and the promise of safe passage when the Allies finally arrived. He became a strategist, a diplomat, a liar of extraordinary skill, playing a game where a single mistake would cost not just his life, but the lives of everyone who depended on him. The winter of 1945 was brutal, one of the coldest on record, and the circus was forced to remain stationary for weeks at a time, when roads became impassable and fuel for the trucks ran out. During one of these periods, camped in a frozen field outside Dresden, Althoff made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The family was dying. He could see it in their faces, feel it in the stillness of the wagon when he opened the door each night. The grandmother had developed pneumonia, her breath rattling in her chest, her skin burning with fever. The children were too weak to sit up. Ruth had stopped eating altogether, saving her portion for her son and daughter. And Peter, the man who had once been a merchant with a thriving business and a future, now looked like a ghost, his body wasted, his mind beginning to fracture under the weight of confinement. Althoff understood that keeping them hidden was no longer enough. If they stayed in the wagon, they would not survive to see liberation. So he made arrangements, dangerous and desperate, to move them to a safer location. A farmhouse owned by a sympathetic contact, a place where they could rest, recover, and wait for the war to end. It was a risk, because movement meant exposure, but staying meant certain death. The family agreed because they had no choice, and preparations were made for the transfer to happen under cover of darkness. But before the plan could be executed, history intervened in the form of fire from the sky. On the night of February 13th, 1945, the Allies launched a bombing campaign on Dresden that would become one of the most controversial acts of the war. Wave after wave of bombers turned the city into an inferno, creating firestorms so intense they sucked the oxygen from the air and incinerated everything within miles. The circus, camped on the outskirts, was far enough from the city center to avoid direct hits, but close enough to feel the earth shake and see the sky turn red. The explosions were so loud they drowned out thought, and the heat was so intense it could be felt through the wooden walls of the wagon. The elephants panicked, their trumpeting lost in the roar of destruction, their massive bodies slamming against the wagon with such force that Althoff feared it would splinter apart. He ran to the wagon, threw open the door and found the family huddled together, the children screaming, the grandmother unconscious, Peter and Ruth clinging to each other as if their bodies could somehow shield their children from the fire that was consuming the world outside. Althoff made a choice in that moment, a choice born of desperation and humanity. He pulled the family from the wagon, carried them one by one to his own tent, and hid them there, among his personal belongings, risking everything on the bet that in the chaos of the bombing no one would notice, no one would care, and no one would ask questions about the strangers in his tent. The bombing lasted for 2 days, and when it finally stopped, Dresden was gone, erased from the map, transformed into a wasteland of ash and twisted metal. Tens of thousands were dead, their bodies buried under rubble or burned beyond recognition. The circus had survived, but barely, and in the aftermath, as survivors wandered through the wreckage, looking for anything that might help them live one more day, Althoff moved the family back into the wagon. They were weaker than ever, but they were alive, and that was all that mattered. The grandmother had survived the pneumonia, though she would never fully recover. The children had stopped crying, their tears exhausted, and Peter and Ruth, holding hands in the darkness, understood that they had witnessed the end of the world and somehow lived to tell about it. The plan to move them to the farmhouse was abandoned because there was no farmhouse left, no contact, no safe place except the one they had always known, the rolling sanctuary of the elephant wagon, their prison and their salvation. April 1945 arrived with the sound of artillery in the distance, a constant rumble that signaled the approach of the Soviet Red Army from the east and American forces from the west. The Third Reich was collapsing in real time, its armies in full retreat, its cities abandoned by officials who had spent years preaching loyalty unto death, but were now fleeing with whatever valuables they could carry. The roads were clogged with refugees, soldiers without units, and deserters who had finally accepted that the war was lost. In this chaos, the circus became almost invisible, just another ragged convoy moving westward, trying to stay ahead of the fighting, trying to reach Allied lines before the Soviets arrived. Althoff knew that liberation was coming, but he also knew that the final days of the war were often the deadliest, that desperate men with guns were more dangerous than organized armies, and that the Buch family, having survived 2 years in hiding, could still die in the last minutes before freedom. The tension inside the wagon reached a breaking point. The family could hear the sounds of war growing closer each day, the crack of rifle fire, the thud of mortars, the screams of civilians caught in crossfire. They knew that the end was near, but they did not know which end it would be, liberation or execution, and the uncertainty was its own form of torture. Peter had begun to lose his grip on reality, his mind fraying under the cumulative weight of confinement, fear, and starvation. He would mutter to himself in the darkness, conversations with people who were not there, arguments with ghosts. Ruth tried to comfort him, but she was barely holding on herself, her body so thin that her bones pressed against her skin like a relief map of suffering. The children had grown silent in a way that went beyond obedience or training. They had simply stopped expecting anything, stopped hoping, stopped believing that the world outside the wagon was anything other than a nightmare. Only the grandmother paradoxically seemed at peace, her fever-bright eyes fixed on some distant point, her lips moving in prayers that had become less a plea for salvation and more a resignation to whatever fate God had chosen. On April 24th, the circus crossed into a small town that had been abandoned by both German forces and civilians, a ghost town of empty buildings and shuttered shops. Althoff decided to stop there for the night, believing it was safer to rest in a place where no one remained to ask questions. He was wrong. As the troop set up camp in the town square, a patrol of Waffen-SS soldiers appeared, stragglers from a unit that had been decimated in a skirmish days earlier. They were young, exhausted, and operating on a mixture of adrenaline and rage. They demanded to inspect the circus, not because they suspected anything specific, but because violence had become their default response to a world that no longer made sense. Althoff tried to placate them, offering food and drink, but the soldiers were beyond bribery. They wanted revenge, someone to punish for their humiliation, and they wanted to search every wagon, every tent, every corner of the camp. The lead soldier, a sergeant with a face like broken stone, walked directly to the elephant wagon. He did not ask permission. He simply grabbed the latch and pulled, his eyes scanning the interior with the practiced efficiency of someone who had conducted 1,000 searches. The elephants, sensing his hostility, began to shift nervously, but the sergeant ignored them, his gaze fixed on the partition at the back. He demanded to know what was behind it. Althoff, his voice steady despite the terror flooding his veins, repeated the lie he had told 100 times before: storage, equipment, nothing of interest. But this time, the lie did not work. The sergeant stepped forward, his hand on his pistol, and ordered Althoff to open the partition. Althoff hesitated, his mind racing through options that no longer existed, and in that moment of hesitation, the sergeant made the decision for him. He raised his pistol, aimed it at the latch, and fired. The bullet splintered the wood, and the partition swung open, revealing the space behind it. For a single frozen moment, the sergeant stared into the darkness, his eyes adjusting to the dim light, his brain processing what he was seeing. 4 figures, skeletal and motionless, stared back at him. The youngest child, too weak to be afraid anymore, simply blinked. The grandmother's lips continued their silent prayer. Ruth held her daughter close, her body a shield that would offer no protection, and Peter, his mind finally snapping under the weight of inevitability, began to laugh, a sound so hollow and broken it seemed less like laughter and more like the final exhalation of hope. The sergeant raised his pistol, his finger tightening on the trigger, and in that instant Adolf Althoff, a man who had spent 2 years avoiding this exact moment, stepped between the gun and the family. He did not speak. He did not plead. He simply stood there, his body blocking the line of fire, his eyes locked on the sergeant's, and waited to see if humanity had any currency left in a world that had spent 6 years trying to extinguish it. The sergeant did not fire, not immediately. He stood there, his pistol still raised, his face contorted with a conflict that played out in the span of seconds, but felt like hours. He was a soldier of the Reich, trained to follow orders, conditioned to see Jews not as people, but as enemies of the state, threats to be eliminated without hesitation or remorse. But he was also a young man, barely 25, who had watched his friends die in the mud of the Eastern Front, who had seen his country reduced to rubble, who understood on some level that the war was over and that every bullet fired now was not a strategic act, but an exercise in futility. Althoff did not move, did not speak, did not break eye contact. He simply stood there, his body a human wall, betting everything on the possibility that exhaustion might outweigh ideology, that a man who had spent years killing might in this one moment choose not to. Behind Althoff, the family waited, their breath held, their bodies frozen, understanding that their lives hung on the decision of a stranger who had every reason to destroy them and no reason to show mercy. The sergeant lowered his pistol, not out of compassion, but out of something closer to indifference. He looked at the skeletal figures in the wagon, at the hollow-eyed children and the grandmother who looked more dead than alive, and seemed to calculate that they were not worth the bullet, not worth the effort, not worth the paperwork that would follow. He told Althoff, his voice flat and emotionless, that he was a fool for risking his life for Jews, that the war was lost, and that everyone associated with this circus would probably be dead within a week anyway. Then he turned and walked away, his patrol following, leaving the wagon open and the family exposed. Althoff stood motionless until the soldiers disappeared around the corner, until their footsteps faded into silence, and only then did he allow himself to breathe. He closed the partition, his hands shaking for the first time in 2 years, and whispered to the family that they were safe, that it was over, that they had survived. But even as he said the words, he knew they were not true. The sergeant could change his mind. Another patrol could arrive. The war was not over, not yet, and safety was still a fantasy. That night, Althoff made the final decision that would determine whether the Buch family lived or died. The circus could not stay in the abandoned town, could not risk another encounter with retreating German forces, who might not show the same restraint. But moving westward meant entering territory that was actively being fought over, roads that were mined, and bridges that had been destroyed. Althoff gathered his most trusted performers, the ones who had suspected for months that something was hidden in the elephant wagon, but had never asked questions, and told them the truth. He told them about the family, about the 2 years of hiding, about the risks they had all unknowingly shared. He expected anger, fear, maybe even betrayal. Instead, the performers simply nodded, their faces grim but resolute, and asked what needed to be done. Althoff laid out the plan. They would travel only at night, avoiding main roads, moving through forests and farmland. They would abandon the larger wagons and take only what was essential. And they would protect the family, all of them, because after 2 years of complicity, they were all in this together. The journey that followed was a nightmare of near misses and narrow escapes. They traveled through darkness, the wagons moving without lights, guided only by moonlight and Althoff's memory of the terrain. They crossed fields still littered with the debris of recent battles, past farmhouses that had been burned to the ground, encountered bodies lying in ditches, soldiers and civilians alike, victims of a war that had devoured everything in its path. Twice they were stopped by patrols, once by retreating Wehrmacht soldiers who were too exhausted to care about a circus, and once by a group of displaced persons who begged for food and were given what little the troop could spare. The Buch family remained in the wagon, silent and invisible, their existence known now to the entire circus, but still secret from the outside world. The elephants, sensing the tension, moved with unusual calm, as if they understood that this was the final act, that everything depended on reaching the other side. On May 2nd, 1945, 6 days after Adolf Hitler's suicide in his Berlin bunker, and 5 days before Germany's unconditional surrender, the circus crossed into territory controlled by American forces. The transition was not marked by fanfare or celebration, just a checkpoint manned by young soldiers who looked almost as exhausted as the people they were processing. Althoff approached the checkpoint alone, his hands raised, and told the American officer in halting English that he had refugees, that he needed help, that there were people in his circus who had been hidden for 2 years and needed medical attention. The officer, a lieutenant from Ohio who had seen enough horror in the past year to last a lifetime, did not ask for details. He simply radioed for medics, ordered the checkpoint opened, and told Althoff to bring his people through. And so the elephant wagon rolled across the line from one world into another, carrying its secret into the light for the first time in 730 days. The door of the elephant wagon opened in daylight for the first time in 2 years, and the Buch family emerged not as triumphant survivors, but as ghosts returning from a realm that should have consumed them. American medics rushed forward, their faces registering shock at the condition of the 4 figures who stumbled out into the spring sunshine. The children could barely walk, their legs atrophied from months of immobility, their eyes squinting against light they had almost forgotten existed. Ruth collapsed immediately, her body simply giving out, now that the adrenaline of survival no longer had a purpose. Peter stood swaying, disoriented, unable to process that the nightmare had actually ended, that the door would not close again, that armed men approaching were there to help rather than kill. The grandmother, carried out on a stretcher, whispered something in Yiddish that no one understood, her eyes streaming with tears that could have been relief or grief, or simply the body's response to an ordeal that had pushed human endurance beyond all reasonable limits. The medics worked quickly, checking vital signs, administering glucose injections, wrapping the family in blankets that seemed impossibly clean and soft. A doctor, a captain from New York who had treated concentration camp survivors and thought he had seen the worst of human suffering, examined the family and quietly told Althoff that they had been days, perhaps hours, from death. The grandmother's pneumonia had returned, her lungs filled with fluid, The children were suffering from severe malnutrition, their bodies cannibalizing muscle tissue to stay alive. Ruth had developed scurvy, her gums bleeding, her teeth loose. Peter's psychological state was fragile, his mind struggling to accept that the danger had passed. The doctor asked Althoff how long they had been hidden, and when Althoff answered 2 years, the doctor simply shook his head in disbelief. He had liberated camps where people had survived months in horrific conditions, but 2 years in a space barely larger than a closet, with no medical care, inadequate food, and the constant threat of discovery, seemed impossible. Yet here they were, breathing, speaking, alive. The circus was processed through the checkpoint and directed to a displaced persons camp that had been established in a former military barracks. The troop was separated from the refugees, classified as non-combatant civilians, and told they would be allowed to continue westward once their papers were verified. But Althoff refused to leave until he knew the Buch family would be cared for. He accompanied them to the medical tent, waited while they were examined, and only when he was assured they would survive did he allow himself to feel the weight of what he had carried for 730 days. He sat outside the tent, his head in his hands, and for the first time since the night he had opened the elephant wagon to 4 terrified strangers, he wept. Not from joy or relief, but from the sheer exhaustion of a man who had held death at bay through nothing more than will and improvisation and blind luck. The Buch family spent 3 weeks in the medical facility, slowly regaining strength, relearning how to eat solid food without their bodies rejecting it, adjusting to a world where silence was no longer mandatory and movement was no longer dangerous. The children began to speak again, hesitantly at first, their voices rusty from disuse. Ruth wrote letters to relatives, hoping to find anyone who had survived, knowing the odds were against her. Peter met with American intelligence officers, providing testimony about the conditions in Germany, the movement of troops, the locations of suspected Nazi officials. And the grandmother, her body still frail but her spirit unbroken, asked to be taken to a synagogue, any synagogue, so she could say the prayers she had whispered in darkness for 2 years, this time out loud, in the light, among people who would understand. Althoff visited them daily, bringing small gifts, fruit and chocolate from American rations, books for the children. He did not stay long, uncomfortable with gratitude, uncomfortable with the label of hero that the American officers had begun to apply to him. He had not saved the family out of ideology or politics, he told anyone who asked. He had done it because it needed to be done, because turning them away would have made him complicit in their murder, because the choice between humanity and survival was not really a choice at all. The officers did not understand this perspective, trained as they were to see courage as something extraordinary, but the Buch family understood perfectly. They knew that Althoff had risked not just his own life, but the lives of everyone in his circus. That discovery would have meant execution for all of them, and that he had carried that burden for 2 years without complaint or expectation of reward. On May 23, 1945, the Buch family was transferred to a displaced persons camp in Bavaria, where they would wait for immigration papers, for news of relatives, for some indication of what their lives would become now that they had been returned from the dead. Althoff accompanied them to the transport truck, helped them load their meager possessions, and said goodbye without ceremony or drama. Peter shook his hand, unable to find words adequate to the moment. Ruth embraced him, whispering thank you in a voice that broke halfway through. The children hugged his legs, the only part of him they could reach. And the grandmother, speaking clearly for the first time in weeks, told him in Yiddish that his name would be remembered, that his deed would be written in the book that God kept for the righteous. Althoff did not understand the words, but he understood the meaning. He watched the truck drive away, carrying the family toward an uncertain future, but away from certain death, and then he returned to his circus, to his elephants, to the life he had always known, forever changed by the decision he had made on a cold April night in 1943. Adolf Althoff returned to his circus and resumed the only life he had ever known, traveling from town to town, setting up tents in fields still scarred by war, performing for audiences who were trying to rebuild their lives from the wreckage of Europe. But something fundamental had changed, not in the circus itself, but in the silence that surrounded what he had done. Althoff never spoke publicly about the Buch family. He did not seek recognition, did not contact newspapers, did not leverage his story for sympathy or advantage in the difficult post-war years when Germany was divided and occupied. To him, what he had done was not heroism, but simply the baseline of human decency, and to celebrate it would be to suggest that protecting innocent lives was somehow exceptional rather than obligatory. His troupe, the performers who had helped protect the secret, followed his lead. They did not talk about the family in the elephant wagon. They did not tell their children or their friends. The story became a ghost within the circus, known but unspoken, a shared memory that bound them together but was never transformed into narrative. The Buch family, meanwhile, tried to build new lives from the fragments of their old ones. Peter and Ruth discovered that most of their extended family had been murdered in the camps. Aunts, uncles, cousins, friends, an entire community erased. They eventually emigrated to Israel in 1948, part of the wave of survivors who believed that only a Jewish state could guarantee their safety. The children grew up, had families of their own, carried the scars of their 2 years in the wagon in ways both visible and invisible. The grandmother lived until 1956, long enough to see her great-grandchildren born, long enough to testify about what had happened, long enough to ensure that at least one record of Adolf Althoff's deed existed. But even her testimony remained obscure, buried in archives unknown to the wider world. The story of the circus director who had hidden a family in an elephant wagon was not the kind of Holocaust narrative that captured public attention in the decades immediately after the war. It was too small, too quiet, too devoid of the dramatic rescue or armed resistance that made for compelling cinema or commemorative monuments. It was not until 1995, 50 years after the war's end, that Adolf Althoff received formal recognition for what he had done. Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to the victims of the Holocaust, awarded him the title of Righteous Among the Nations, an honor reserved for non-Jews who risked their lives to save Jews during the Nazi era. By then, Althoff had been dead for more than 20 years, having passed away in 1970 in quiet obscurity. His widow accepted the honor on his behalf, traveling to Jerusalem to plant a tree in his name on the Avenue of the Righteous, joining thousands of other trees representing thousands of other individuals who had chosen humanity over complicity. The ceremony was brief, attended by aging members of the Buch family and a handful of historians who specialized in rescue stories. The media coverage was minimal. The story did not trend. The world, busy with its own concerns, barely noticed. But the lack of recognition does not diminish the magnitude of what Adolf Althoff accomplished. For 730 days, he woke up knowing that discovery meant death, not just for him but for everyone he cared about. For 730 days, he lied to Nazi officers, forged documents, bribed officials, and orchestrated a deception so intricate that a single mistake would have unraveled everything. For 730 days, he carried the weight of 4 lives on his shoulders, lives that depended entirely on his ability to improvise, adapt, and outthink a regime that had made murder a bureaucratic function. He did this without training, without support from organized resistance networks, without the benefit of distance or borders. He did it in the heart of Nazi Germany, under constant surveillance, while performing for audiences that included the very people who would have killed him if they had known the truth. And he did it not for ideology or politics or future recognition, but simply because when a desperate man asked for help, Althoff said yes. The story of the circus director and the elephant wagon is not unique in the sense that thousands of individuals across Europe made similar choices during the Holocaust, hiding Jews in attics, basements, barns, and convents. But it is unique in its particulars, in the sheer audacity of hiding a family in a moving vehicle that was subject to constant inspection, in the proximity to danger that defined every moment of those 2 years, in the role that 3 elephants, creatures of instinct and routine, played in creating a cover story that somehow held. It is a reminder that rescue was not always the work of saints or soldiers, but sometimes the work of ordinary people, circus performers and animal trainers, who found themselves at a moral crossroads and chose the harder path. It is a reminder that heroism does not always announce itself with grand gestures, that sometimes it whispers, that sometimes it looks like a man opening a wagon door in the middle of the night and saying simply, "Come in." And it is a reminder, perhaps most importantly, that history has a way of burying the stories that do not fit neatly into established narratives, that the Holocaust is not just the story of camps and gas chambers, but also the story of 1,000 small rebellions, 1,000 quiet refusals to participate in evil, 1,000 acts of defiance that took the form not of violence but of protection. Adolf Althoff's name is not widely known. His story is not taught in schools. There are no blockbuster films about the circus director who hid a family in an elephant wagon. But the Buch family survived. 4 people who should have been murdered lived to see liberation, to have children, to tell their story. And that survival, purchased at immense risk by a man who asked for nothing in return, stands as proof that even in the darkest moments of human history, when the machinery of genocide was operating at full capacity and the majority chose complicity or indifference, some individuals still chose differently. They chose to hide rather than expose. They chose to protect rather than profit. They chose, in the end, to be human. And that choice, quiet and uncelebrated as it may be, is the reason we must remember Adolf Althoff, the circus director who opened his elephant wagon and changed the course of 4 lives, proving that sometimes the greatest acts of courage happen not on battlefields, but in the spaces between the floorboards, in the gaps behind the hay bales, in the rolling sanctuary of a wagon that smelled of animals and salvation.